Okay, good morning, everyone. Oh, let's try it. I know it's snowy. I know it's winter time still, even though it's supposed to be spring. Good morning, everybody. Much better, thank you. And what's going to frustrate me the most is that I'm not going to be able to take time to go around. I really want to get to know each and every one of you and know face to name. So throughout the day when we've got some breaks, please come up and introduce yourself because I'd love to know that. I'm Michele Carmichael. I'm the Behavioral Health Supports Consultant, and I'm a part of a coalition that you see here. Little history, very quick. I was at the State Board of Education for 10 years. So I was the individual that did the IARSS Trauma Trainer of Trainers last summer. And in the process, I was considering retiring, and a couple individuals came to me and said, would you like to come to the ROEs instead? So I've been blessed. I'm working specifically with Peoria area and Galesburg, Monmouth area, along with Macomb and Tazewell. So I've got 4 regional offices that I kind of work with across the area. And basically I get to do exactly what I did at the state level now at the local level, which means a lot more to me because now I can see the impact. I just want to tell you that when I started this process that I'm going to share with you with our areas, I always introduced myself in this way to them and just kind of talked to them about who I was, where I come from, the space I'm coming from. And in particular, the last one is that I myself celebrate life experiences with trauma. We talk a lot about adverse childhood experiences, and I do give them some specific, very personal examples, which is difficult when you haven't built trust with everybody in a very quick manner, but it really brings it to the forefront. I also want them to know that I am biased, because I am a white, middle-aged, I am going to say middle-aged, not elderly yet, educator. So my bias is from that perspective, and they needed to be aware of it. But it lets them know who I am, and in turn then I ask them to do the same. Through one of the last face-to-face meetings that we did, I actually had them tell me what their personal motto was. So they get to meet me through mine. Collaboration is huge, not cooperation, but collaboration. I think it's really key that we understand that there is a difference. I'm also very, very big on systems. I was a national trainer around PBIS and also handled all of those initiatives at the state board over those 10 years. And so I call myself actually, though, with the trauma-informed practice piece, reformed PBISer, because there are certain things that we have to be wary of when we're talking about trauma-informed practices. And then I also give them a little background information on where my training comes from. I've actually been blessed to be trained by Dr. Bruce Perry, if you're familiar with The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog book. He is the author of that, amongst a number of other things. I've spent pretty much the last 4 years with him, very closely connected with him and his staff at the Child Trauma Academy. So that's where my perspective comes from. It's much more systems-based. It's not necessarily practice-oriented. So to let you know what we did, we developed a professional learning plan for our area, which was focused around PLCs, professional learning communities, which could then broaden into professional learning networks. And the professional learning plan that we had was very systemic in the approach that we did. So we started with, in general, we called them behavioral health supports, PLCs. And I'm going to break down each one of these and drill a little deeper. We also did book study PLCs. We had 2 books that we considered. I am in the process right now of developing a toolkit for our area, for that consortium area. And within that toolkit, there are open Google Docs. So there was constant feedback from individuals and conversations around the resources that are being developed. And then we had specific district professional learning. So if there was like East Peoria High School or Monmouth Roseville, they asked me to come in to do like a SIP day. The only way I would do that is if then I could follow up with additional days, either through webinars or through coaching models. So we did do that for districts, and we've only done this since July. So this is just in the process, and I can tell you how it's going with some of your questions later. What we focused on, however, if I go back to the very first slide, I really want to key in It was implementing a culture of caring for youth and staff professional learning series because I wanted it to be focused on understanding climate and culture as a whole, but to know that I definitely did not want trauma to be the latest buzzword because it has become a buzzword. And that's what happened with PBIS, that's what happened with MTSS, that's what's happened with all of these other acronyms. And a part of that was our fault at the state because we didn't provide enough of the background systems information through our initial trainings. I think we got better at it as we moved forward, but I just didn't want it to become your latest acronym. So we really needed to look at how does the trauma-informed practice piece fit into the overall climate and culture. Real quick, what's the difference between climate and culture? Any ideas on that? We use that language a lot too, don't we? It's a buzzword language. All of those I agree with, and add more to that would be when you walk into a building, you can feel the climate immediately, right? It's how we feel. Within the first 2 minutes, I know, and I do this all the time. Pat, Derry and I walked through East Peoria High School together, and as we're walking out, he looked at me and he goes, I just would love to be in your head right now, wondering what you're looking for. And I said, well, really, all I'm looking for are the kids looking at me as I say hello, and do they respond back? Because most of the time, if the majority of the students, when you're walking into a building, will look at adults that they do not know and respond to them, they feel safe. That is a good indication of feeling safe and trusting within their environment. That's that climate. The culture, like many of you stated, it has to do with the unspoken norms that are there. It's very difficult for a new teacher to walk into a team that's been teaching for more than 3 years together because they've built their own culture of how things get done. That doesn't necessarily mean we cannot impact it, but we have to be very respectful of what came before, and also how do we challenge it so that it doesn't cause more friction to break those relationships. So just to kind of let you know what the structure was that we did for the Behavioral Health Supports PLC is that I wanted to model human-centered learning. Stanford Initiative and Sesame Street, both of those together, the Cooney Foundation does a lot of work around the human-centered learning perspective. And where it is you put individuals, adults, into a setting where they can actually empathize with the individuals that they're going to be working with. So I wanted to work with all of you and teachers and educators and admin and pupil personnel services and get them to a place where they could actually empathize with the students that they would be working with. So we started out with a lot of different activities to get them to look at the students that we're talking about in particular related to trauma-informed practices, and also get them to a place where they could look at the situation now and say, what can I do for all kids that will also help those students that are impacted by adverse childhood experiences? I wanted them to then work through different problems to generate multiple solutions. One of the analogies that I use with all of my PLCs is I was blessed to be able to see the previous president before he was even president. Whether you have any political choice doesn't mean anything with this, but he was a senator, Senator Barack Obama at the time, made a presentation to the Senate, and I was there, and he talked about, as a group, that we needed to come up with multiple solutions, and he used the analogy of a car on the side of the road with a flat tire. If I'm driving that car and I get stuck on the side of the road, there are multiple ways for me to get to my next location, destination in the right amount of time to get them there on time. So we talked about how we can all come to understanding there are multiple solutions to all problems. I also didn't want to just do what I'm doing here today with you, in some ways regurgitating information. I wanted to make sure that it was part sharing of information, sharing best practice and research, but then also them working within that research to come to some understanding of how it can help and support their actual students. So we really talked about authentic learning and relevant learning. I did share lots of recaps of research, which you'll see as I kind of go through this, and gave always the links. With our PLCs, we actually have an open Google folder that was shared with everyone. So those resources would be uploaded after every PLC, and then we had some homework that we did with those different resource links. And then the idea of utilizing progressive approximation, I liken that to the ping pong ball, where you've got the boundaries, but you want to get it closer and closer and closer to the hole. That's kind of what we did. We would practice, we would talk, we would have conversations, they would go back, implement, they would bring it back to the next meeting. Well, these are the issues that we had, and we would go through along with sharing some new information. So we kept trying to get closer and closer. Just to give you some visuals of how we did that human-centered learning, our first face-to-face meeting, prior to that, they were given some instructions to go out and interview 2 students. One student who was successful and one student who wasn't. I gave them some interview questions that could be adjusted accordingly to age all the way down to early childhood, because I did have early childhood through 12th grade participants. And with that, I gave them, we call this a mandala, and they had to come up with, through that interview question process, when they came together at the first PLC, they shared their responses to the interviews, and then they came up with what do they thought the beliefs were for those students, what were their motivators, what kinds of things would they want to be able to do, did they like to do. And we came up with 2 different student mandalas out of those groups. And these long slips of paper that you see there are actual need statements that the participants developed. So out of all of those beliefs and motivators, they came up with what that student might need to be successful. As you can imagine, when I said one student who was successful, another who wasn't, I would say 100% of the students who were not successful were either impacted by trauma or had some behavioral health, mental health, or substance use issue. We also dealt a lot with barriers each time we met. What were some of the barriers for implementing what you tried to do, et cetera. And as you can see, this happened to be one of the PowerPoints from our virtual meetings where we would discuss one of the research studies that I would bring to the table. This happened to be about self-regulation, and then they would also get the link and different activities to do with that resource after the fact. So human-centered learning process is included in this PowerPoint for you, but basically it's problem solving. It's looking to see what the issues are, what do we already have in place, what's not working for us, and then generating possible solutions, outlining, building responses, testing, and then reviewing. So coming back and forth. Yes. Okay, so now that our adrenaline has just raised, let's just shrug your shoulders and let's get back into it, right? Okay, so the other piece of human-centered learning is throughout the process, I took different levels of altitudes. So we would look at some of the systems pieces, we would look at more within our own classroom subsystems, and then we would look at the individual student needs. Cindy talked about norms. Some of the norms that we developed are here. Some that I needed, and the way that I present norms is how we work well together. What do we each need? So some of these were mine and some were their turn to come up with some others. The 2 before me is for those externalizers versus the internalizer individuals who are very quiet. We tried to make sure that at least 2 people spoke before they spoke again if they were very outgoing. And all of these other things I think are pretty similar to ones that you've seen before, except maybe this one. I, right from the beginning, told them that I think as a human we tend to generalize and assume. And so please understand that I come from a place of pure intent at all times, and I'm not trying to assume that you don't know these things. It might just be as a reminder, and that in all of our time together, I will try and actually hear your voice more than mine as much as possible. Okay, these were some of the PLC topics. that we covered. We had face-to-faces and we had virtual, which I'll explain in just a minute. But we started with teaming structures at the face-to-face to understand the norms. So we really set the structure for PLCs for them. We talked about students, that the intent of the PLC is that we are trying to build the environment that's effective for all students, but especially students with behavioral health needs, those that are impacted by trauma, et cetera. Did a lot of work around ACEs and adverse childhood experiences, and especially the Bruce Perry work around the neurosequential development of the brain and how ACEs impacts that development in students. We talked about the mindset that it takes to be trauma-informed and what that means. We then broadened that to more school climate pieces and what that means. In turn, then, we started our work around Perry's 6 core strengths, which starts with attachment, moving into affiliation, then awareness. The attachment was the same thing that we talked about with what does strong, safe, supportive relationships really mean and look like. Moving then into resiliency. And that resiliency, there's a huge gambit of skills within the bucket of resiliency. Self-regulation being the number one. And we talked about the 3 types of self-regulation, that there's behavioral, emotional, and cognitive self-regulation and the differences of those and how can we teach that directly. We then went to support, again, the mindset to understand what's teacher-centered versus student-centered classrooms. We were just talking about that at the table, and how that changes the perspective of the amount of work we're doing versus giving the skill away so that the students are doing the learning more. We connected all of these dots then in our last virtual meeting to understand what the Compassionate Schools framework really means and what that includes. And then we moved into, for our last session, really a connecting of the dots from the teaming all the way down to engaging instructional practices and growth versus fixed mindsets, which then ended with employee wellness and self-care. Because any of us who believe that we cannot be impacted by the work that we're doing, it's like walking through a rainstorm and not getting wet. We have to understand that we all are impacted by that. So what did our PLCs look like specifically for the behavioral health supports? We had 2 face-to-face. They bookended. So we had an all-day back in the fall, and we just are finishing the all-day this month now, which is the last one. And then 3 virtual meetings throughout, which were an hour and a half each. I had 4 groups going throughout the whole fall and spring sessions and winter sessions. 2 that were early childhood through 4th grade. I had 1 in the Peoria area and 1 in the Galesburg area going, and then 2 that were 5th through 12th. I chose that break very intently. I chose that because what I found is that a lot of the 4th grade feel they're more at that junior high or middle school level, and they need to understand that a lot of those practices need to continue on even into the 4th grade. At the same time, I did the 12th grade so that they would understand that what we were trying to do in the elementary and middle still carried through on into the high school level. While we did this, our virtuals were done through Adobe Connect. And so we actually, at the very first face-to-face meeting, had Illinois Virtual Schools come, and they actually presented and got everybody set up if they brought their own device with them. We got that all set up. I also was lucky enough to have Brian on the Galesburg-Monmouth side, and then I had Cindy over on our side that we could support. We actually had IVS in the Peoria office, so we had virtual support then at every meeting. Daniel Lewis is phenomenal. Brian's been phenomenal support on that. But they would be on the call or the interaction, the PLC, with me at all times. They could monitor the chat box for me so that I was doing the work. It got to the point, though, by the last one, I think I was pretty well doing it by myself. But it was very nice to have that additional support. And then what we did after each virtual meeting, and the face-to-face, is I gave them different individual activities where they would then go and meet with their own mini PLCs. So most of them came, I don't think I had anybody come by themselves to the training. It was always with a team of 3 or more. So they then connected, we seated them at the very face-to-face with other districts also. And so they were able to come together and meet outside of work and discuss their individual activities that they did so that they could process the information. They would put their individual homework into their own folder, and I would look at that and provide feedback. And then they would come together as a team and do a team response template summarizing some of their thoughts from their team interaction. So this just happens to be one of the individual. I gave them co-regulation from birth through young adulthood, a practice brief. As an individual, they would read it, and then they would give responses to it. Then they would come together as a team and talk about the interesting points and concerns and questions. And then they would put that. The second type of PLC then that we used related to trauma-informed practices and behavioral health supports were book studies. We did A Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. Those were offered just because of, you know, how people not wanting to necessarily engage after hours in the wintertime. We didn't have as many. We had it going over on the Peoria side. Did we get it going up over? No, we didn't have enough over there. And then we also offered choice words. If you're not familiar with choice words, Peter Johnston. It's more elementary based and very literacy oriented, but it really talks about how your words can have a great deal of meaning just in the way that you present your language. Instead of saying, here's a math sheet with 10 problems and 2 extra credit, you might change it to, wow, today we're going to work on a math sheet that I know you all have the skills to do. There's 10 problems along with 2 that are a little more challenging. Each of you have the skill to be able to complete the extra 2 that are challenging. At least one of them I know for sure, but I'm anxious to see how well you do with the second one also. So it's just the way you change your word choice can help build that personal agency so that they want to do and believe that they can do. We also had district-specific professional learning. For example, I work in a middle school where there's PLC time given by grade level once a week. And there are different topics then. I only have them for about 45 minutes. So I present real quick on a topic that takes about 10 minutes maybe, and then we have a lot of facilitated conversations. Some of the topics that we've shared so far are, you know, the basic Illinois SEL standards, which amazes me. Many teachers still do not embed those or integrate those into their curriculum. ACEs and its impact on brain development. The 6 core strengths of child development that are hierarchical, so if they cannot attach, don't expect them to respect. So we go through those individually: self-regulation, development, student engagement, employee wellness, etc. The toolkit that I mentioned to you is a living document. I'm still in the process of finishing it. I have all the resources identified, but now I just am working on the narrative now. It's 2 Google folders, which will be shared out. One's the educator version, and the other's the administrator addendum. This is much more topical and practice-oriented. This is much more systems-oriented. I use the analogy of the bookshelf. If you have lots of practices, which are the books on the shelf, if the shelf itself is not stable and supportive, the practices will fall away. If you just do trauma-informed practices as a soundbite, as a book, and you don't have those support structures in place, then 2 years from now, we're going to be on to something new. So we really wanted to focus on that. So just to give you an idea, in the educator version, we have background, social emotional learning, safe, supportive, resiliency, trauma, mental health, and the difference between that we need to understand, and what we're really trying to push through the state is that we look through a trauma lens first before we move to a diagnosis of mental health, because we may be doing some harm to our children, automatically assuming. I use an analogy I showed the picture of there's a chalice or two faces, depending upon we're all looking at the same thing, but we may perceive something different. With our children, that's the same way in our classrooms. If we think that a child has ADD, ADHD, then the best practice for that is medication and behavioral intervention. But if those same symptoms can also be a child impacted by trauma, and that type of intervention is repetitive, regulated, relational. So we might be providing a pharmacological intervention that really is doing more harm than good for many of our children. So if we start with that, not to say drugs aren't good, because in many times they do support our children in a necessary manner. But we really discussed the difference between trauma and mental health. Classroom management, student engagement, educator self-care, school organization, and then school community partnerships. How do I work with community partners as a classroom teacher or pupil personnel service member? An example of the section on social emotional learning, this is kind of what it looks like. Background information narrative with PowerPoints for different audiences, resource links, resources for classroom instruction, and then an open Google Doc for ongoing scenarios that people may want to put in there and other groups can respond to. This was just the example. I'm not going to really go through it very fast, but this is just PowerPoint, gives you what the intent was, and every PowerPoint then ends with a little self-assessment. Short ones could be done within a staff meeting or could be just an individual going through it themselves. The administrator addendum then, if you recall, I said is much more system-focused. Introduction, background, change process, organizational structures, climate and culture, community partnerships, employee wellness, and then addressing barriers. I just shared with you the visual that I use for the multi-tiered approach, but that if we don't take into account leadership, communication, training, and professional learning and look at those in a very directed manner and collect data around that, problem solve, etc., then these books on the shelf will never be supported for long-term student growth. This will kind of give you an idea of the resources that I provide. There's articles with the actual links, there's websites, videos, and journals, and then books that they can actually find more information. And what we did throughout the broader PLC was we had a resource list just like this, and after each topic was introduced, more resources got added into that resource list. Then they would take these and they could do individual reading and provide a response for CPDU credit. Along with that, they can turn around and then meet with their mini PLC to discuss the multiple responses that they had. Another area within the addendum was school climate and culture, really going into the components of it and then listing out the resource. These were all just the different strategies. Employee wellness. Within that section, especially for the administrators, we talk a lot about the difference between burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma, because many, now that I am back in the field, I like to go back. I've been back and forth from different administrative levels back to the field, and that's intentional, to be truthful on my part. The last time that I was now, it's been 10 years. And this has been the longest time period that I've done that, and it's a huge difference, not only within the structure of our students and families, but also within the culture of buildings I'm seeing. And a lot of it is related to what I see, the majority of our teachers having serious compassion fatigue, related to initiative fatigue, but mostly because of the level of issues that our students are coming to in many of our school settings, and the teachers not having the skills to be able to work with those students. It's not that they can't acquire them, it's just they don't have them, and they're very frustrated with that because the majority, as we all know, of teachers come to that profession because they want to help and they don't feel like they are helping. So we talk a lot about compassion fatigue and the phases of compassion fatigue. And then in that way, it helps those teachers understand their own trauma that they are dealing with, along with the vicarious trauma that they may be carrying. So then we talk about addressing barriers, and this is where we have an open Google Doc there for administrators to talk about how implementing this culture, they're running up against some barriers and what we can do to support them, and then the administrators themselves can have that open conversation. So I want to give you plenty of time to ask some clarifying questions and then move into your own conversation. But in before we start, I wanted to share with you, these are just 3 examples so far of about 12 that I have. This was our last face-to-face meeting. I've met now with both groups of early childhood through 4th and one group of 5th through 12th. You'll see up here an example from each group. There's 2 from that are early childhood through 4th grade and one that's a high school. I'm not going to tell you which. But there we met, and the way I introduced the last session was just really talking about what we've done over the last 7 months together and summarizing it. And then their activity immediately following that was to write a letter to a new educator coming either into the field or into their building, and to share with them what types of things they need to consider as they're implementing a culture of caring for youth and staff. So these are the examples. They came together, they each did their own individual letters, and then I brought them together as groups of 3 or 4. They read their letters, and then they pick and chose the best pieces of each that they felt and combined it and did a larger letter that really summarized what they believe that environment should look like. And what I told them after the fact is, and then for all of you to understand, this was my summative assessment for the PLC. I know I will have feedback that's going to come to both Cindy and Brian after the evaluation, but that's more about structure to me. I wanted to know what they'd actually learned. And so as you take time to read some of these letters, hopefully you'll see those very same topics that we started with at the beginning of the year. So that's my presentation. What questions might you have?
You feel like this has been or have you gotten to the heart of the problem, or has this been more of a process to get to that heart of the problem?
I love that question. What are your initial thoughts? How would you respond to that initially?
I would think that it would be a process, but I wonder if that has opened more cans of worms, more to speak, or more thinking, and has it really helped that system, I guess, or helped that?
Okay. It actually followed my pattern of asking 5 whys. I always believe that if you have a problem, if you ask why that problem's happening, and then you ask why that happened, then you ask why that happened, and you go back 5 times, you'll usually end up at the root cause, if not before, at least by the 5th question. And what ended up happening through this process is it taught them to start questioning why they were doing certain things. Why my favorite question to them is Dr. Phil's, well, how's it working for you? And so they would always say, well, this isn't happening or that. And I'm like, well, what have we tried? And then how's it working for you? And what came out of that, the example that I will give you and then let you decide if you think this is getting to the root of the matter. I was working with an early childhood educator. And I also did throughout this, if anybody wanted me to come in and observe their classroom, I have an observation form that has not only climate and culture, but also engaging instructional practices that I monitor and look for when I'm in their classroom. And I go back more than one time to see, because one time in is never going to give you a full picture. And then my report back to them is a coaching report. It provides feedback and suggestions, just like those resource pages. I would give possible suggestions of different strategies that they might try with links to further information. And this teacher decided, I gave her like 6, not expecting, and she knows that it wasn't expected that she would do all 6. Well, she went and she actually implemented all 6 of them. And so I went back after about 6 weeks and we met again. I did another observation, gave her some additional feedback, and then we had conversation. And I said, so what are your thoughts around this? And she said, Michelle, everything you told me, it works. It totally works when I do it. The problem is I'm not consistent. And I was like, that's what, if we want to build the environment, we know it's not the student's fault. It's the adults in the environment that need to build it to be successful for the students. So just the fact that she became self-aware was huge for me. And so from that point forward, it was a matter of, well, now that you know that, where do you want to go? What do you want to do? And so she needed support on how to help her to be more consistent. And she happens to be in the early childhood, so she's blessed with an aide. So we had more conversations with how they should be teaming closer and working closer together. I went in, did some modeling with them. So the question you started with, is this a process, and at the same time, does this get to the heart? I think it does both. And the one thing that I always teach is there's not an either or for anything. It's always a continuum, and we forget the middle part of the continuum. We think it's either going to work or it's not. There's times when we may have moved 2 steps forward, we just didn't get to the fruition of it, but at least we're aware, and once we know better, we do better. So, what other questions might you have?
Perfect. I was thinking more deeply about the PLC topics that you mentioned for those teams, and I'm wondering...
It's going to make us sick going backwards. Let me just do this quick.
Okay. So I was looking at those, and I was wondering if those were determined based on the needs of that school or district, or if it was something that you felt that they would benefit from, and then also if they were differentiated by the grade level band, since you split early childhood up to 4th grade. If you could just speak a little bit about that process.
Okay. This was for the broader large groups. So the majority of these came from my training that I've had and what I've seen in the state and the needs. At the same time, though, I would adjust depending upon the group for the next month. So I gave choices. I think one of the very first virtual meetings, I said we can go 2 different directions. Which would you prefer? And they all came back with the same, so we focused in one area. Now, the way I categorized by grade level bands was the resources that I provided. So the topics remain the same because the topics, basically what I was trying to implement with them is an understanding that our brains develop sequentially. And if there has been adverse childhood experiences that impact the brain at any certain developmental stage, if we can figure out when that occurs, we know what types of interventions to implement. And hierarchically, sequentially, the first piece after a child's born, the first piece that a child learns is attachment. And if they, even in the 12th grade, have not learned how to build relationships, and we can see that through the behaviors, then it's part of our responsibility to teach them. And the example that I give them is myself being 30-some years of age, not knowing how to make friends, and what my husband had helped me to do when I went to a training once. So that whole process helped them to understand that it doesn't matter how old you are, because of the way your brain has been impacted, your perception changes. So I would use, for the early childhood elementary grades, I would use resources that were more related to how do I do this in an elementary classroom or with early childhood students. There was one strategy during the virtual meetings that I used across all of them. And it was one article that I shared that was a middle school article, and yet reading through it, the early childhood staff picked right up on why it was appropriate for them. And it talked about working with difficult students. And one of the strategies is reframing the negative behavior. So when you have a student, think about a middle schooler, student that is a leader and yet in inappropriate ways that can cause a lot of chaos in your classrooms. How do you work with that student? How do you talk to that student to try and reframe their behavior? They were able to see that strategy could be used no matter if they were early childhood all the way through 12. What other questions might you have? Yeah.
My question is, so far, just piggybacking off of what you said, a lot of this is how do we I can understand how to get one teacher engaged, but in the community, not everybody is going to be engaged at the same time. So if my classroom, I'm engaged with this, but the next one is not, how do you get us all involved and engaged with this? As so far we're getting, that's what the community is supposed to do.
Well, that's probably going to be the next layer. We already got feedback from everybody so far that's gone through it. One of the very first ones is they want to keep going with this. And in addition to, we talked a lot about the actual theory called diffusion theory, which is best practice. Diffusion theory, and there is a lot of literature out there about it. Dr. Mark Adkins up at UIC has done a lot of work around this. But it's where you have your teacher leaders, and I do not mean your educators that are the gophers for your administration, the ones that do everything for them. That's not who I'm talking about. I'm talking about the ones that their peers respect them. So there are those leaders in every building that peers respect, and in turn, if they implement some of these strategies and show success, then teachers around them want to know, what are you doing? And then they can start becoming the guidance and coaching model for that. So the majority of the individuals that came to these, when we did our, I wish I had our flyer that we had put in there, but in the flyer information, when we first talked about the PLC to begin with, it talked about sending teams of individuals that would be the individuals to go back and support the implementation of this in your schools and districts. So all of them came expecting, and at the last meeting, that was one of the things that they were most concerned about, because they're like, okay, we're supposed to go back now and present. So we talked about how they have a huge Google folder of information. They have all of the PowerPoints that we shared throughout this whole time. And they have me as a resource. So the majority of them are developing their PowerPoints right now to present back to their staff. They're going to send them through me. I'll provide feedback, and they'll also be able to put it in our open Google Docs so that they can have that conversation amongst each other.
First of all, thank you. This is like amazing. This is a lot of information. I have a lot of questions, but I guess if I have to pick one, it would be, what might a conversation sound like between yourself and like a school administrative team or district leadership team that wants guidance on how to measure their progress towards realizing a culture of caring versus maybe a culture, going from a culture of callousness to a culture of caring?
Right.
What might that guidance look and sound like?
One of the things that you might have picked up from me, but probably not, is usually I throw the questions back. So I would always give an open-ended question back to them about, how do you know now, if you believe that you don't have this culture, what is showing you that? And this just happened with Becky. We had this conversation, and she said, well, we'd have a lot of teachers that are absent all the time. I said, okay, so attendance with teachers. And she's like, oh, well then that means attendance with students. I said, exactly. And then we talked about nurses' visits. All of that just started a conversation around, what does a culture of caring really entail? Well, people are going to be attending school more regularly. They're going to be more engaged in trying more more student-centered activities than teacher-centered. The observation form that I use is it's like a walkthrough, but it's very in-depth. So we would be seeing a lot of those types of strategies being used in our classrooms. Really, when we talked about it, if I would throw it back to you all now, what would a culture of non-caring look like to you? How would you know that people don't care about each other? What are your thoughts? Okay. So they start not socializing, so you could take that as an indicator. If I have a social time, how many actually show up? Okay. Just like with parent-teacher organizations, we know if they're engaged by the number that actually attend in some ways. Okay, that's one indicator. That's not the whole thing. What's other ways that you might know that you don't have a strong culture of caring? There is a data point that all of you have access to. Okay, so how would you, what piece of data are currently being, or what pieces of data are currently being collected now to let you know about attitudes or perceptions of teachers? Illinois 5 Essentials, or whatever climate survey you might be using. We actually, that's going to be in the future for our PLCs, how to utilize that data. As an administrator, that's going to be part of the toolkit, and or any other climate survey. Can anybody think of any other, let's think about students. What would be indicators that the students don't feel safe or supported within that culture? There's the standard, besides attendance, but there's also the standard office discipline referrals, right? Okay. Student surveys, student nurse visits. Right. We also talked a lot about in the classrooms themselves to have their peer come in and actually monitor. If we have a culture of caring, we talked a lot about that there's positivity. It's, that was one of our last things also when we talked about the growth mindset and the fixed mindset. Introducing that, I talked about the power of negativity and the power of positivity and what that really means and the research behind that. And so for the positive and the negative side, we actually talked to them about having a peer coming in and monitoring you for a 5-minute period of time. How many positive acknowledgments and interactions did you have with students versus negative? That in and of itself, not tangible social interactions, that in and of itself was very eye-opening for the majority of teachers that decided to do that. But again, it's building of trust amongst each other that you can do those kinds of things.
I don't know if this is clarifying or not, but you were talking about 10 years ago and now, and you were finding behaviors on the part of teachers, certain things more so. I was thinking about logistically how have you made any changes to your program or addressed the issues of larger staff turnover, generational issues, more part-time people who have a harder time building those relationships.
We have a lot of guest teachers in our buildings.
Even getting people together for that 1 hour, pretty hard to do to get everybody to the table. So it's just a whole different ball game than it used to be back in the day, and I was wondering how that affects your approach in dealing with these.
Number one, I have a growth mindset that anything can be solved as long as we put two or more heads together. So that's first, that's my mentality to begin with. But I will give you an example. I don't know if this will answer exactly the question. Let me know if it doesn't. There's the middle school that I'm working with now actually has a faculty of about 45, probably. They have 12 permanent subs, or guest teachers as I call them, right now in that setting, okay, and have had that. I have full attendance at every PLC, including the guest teachers. I also have a leader that believes in it, but I have also built my, the respect of the group that's there, that I'm not going to waste their time when I come. So they come, they show up, they have questions when they come, and they're anxious to hear the information that we share. So I deal with it that way. I think what we need to remember is that it's not just our children that have been impacted by the trauma. Our adults in all of our society has been impacted by multiple traumas. It's very few and far between now that I find an educator where in the past we might have done an adverse childhood experience checklist individually for themselves. It's very rare that I will find an educator that has 0 or 1, if they're willing to share. The majority of them have either been through multiple traumas or have been impacted by tornadoes or flooding. So same type of chronic stress that is going to have the same type of impact. So my job, my responsibility is to build the environment for them to be successful so that they can build the environment for their students to be successful. And that's just how I approach it each day. Did that answer what you were thinking of? Okay. I'd love to have a further conversation around that too. It is. And that's one of the things when we do this, that's one of the very first things we do, we talk about. A lot of Bruce's work now is moving into epigenetics, which talks about multi-generational trauma and how babies are actually being born with higher blood pressure, higher heart rates, et cetera. We need to understand that we ourselves have that. The big difference, though, that I'm anxious to see what you pick up from the other two. The big difference that I chose the path, I knew there was a lot of things already happening in the state related to strategies. My group does not need to know how to do mindfulness from me. There are other people who can train that practice, that strategy. There are other people who can train student yoga. My process was to understand, and this is where I thought we did not do it justice enough when we did the initial trainings around multi-tiered systems and PBIS structures, is to understand why we're doing mindfulness. What does that yoga do for children? It's repetitive, it's regulated, it's relational, and that's what a lot of our children and adults need to build a healing community, as Bruce will say. So this isn't just for students. We're also doing it, just to let you know, we did it with law enforcement in our area, planning to do parent cafes with a lot of this work eventually. So it's very similar. We talk about poverty, we talk about generational pieces. I just don't silo those things. I integrate and embed them in the conversations that we have, just like we want our teachers to integrate SEL development.